All right. Today we're going to be talking about the psychology of the eighth house in astrology, giving you the full meaning explained. First, we're going to be going through the components of the eighth house, giving you a more detailed look at what this area of life is represented internally from a psychological perspective. Then we're going to be going through the qualities. What does an eighth house that is healthy look like? How does that manifest psychologically? An unhealthy eighth house, how does that manifest psychologically? And how to evaluate if the eighth house is manifesting in a healthy or more afflicted, destructive way based off of your chart. But you also can just see if the healthy description or the unhealthy description manifests in your life or the people in your life that you're looking to assess or understand deeper. So let's get started. First, the eighth house is a moksha succedent house. Now, as we talked about in the fourth house, moksha houses are all about liberation. They're about freedom, internal development, your emotions, your spiritual life, because moksha is about working on the internal blocks, working on the internal space, working on your spiritual development, so you no longer have to go through the death rebirth cycle. Ironically enough, eighth house represents death and rebirth, transformation. I'm going to get to that in a second, but moksha itself, all the moksha houses, which comes to 4, 8, 12, 4, 8, 12, these houses are aligned with spirituality, emotions, internal development, contemplation, right? These are different aspects of moksha, which the whole point of all these activities is to free yourself from the karmic cycle of death and rebirth. Simple as that. And they oppose the artha houses, which are more material. So, artha houses are about working in the external manifest world. Moksha houses are hidden houses. They're about your internal space, more your private development. Your private, intimate moments are associated more so with the moksha houses. Succedent, the second part of the eighth house, represents security, stability. We talked about it with the second house and the fifth house. Now we're at the eighth house. It is security, stability, consistency, steadfastness, solid and enduring, more stable than the other forms of cadent and angle houses. All right? So you have security, stability, consistency. In the synthesis, you mix it with spiritual liberation or emotions or contemplation. So essentially what you have is you have emotional security in the eighth house. That's what the eighth house represents, emotional security, which is opposite material security, the second house, because as you will understand, the entire chart is a reflection. It's like a mirror of itself. You can cut it into many different halves with the houses, the signs mirroring each other based off of the circle, the cycle that is the zodiac. So we had the seventh house, seventh bhava, being a reflection of the first, right? The first house is you. Seventh house is your partner. First house is your gender expression, your sex, your birth sex. Opposite house is the opposite sex or the opposite gender expression. Your mirror, your partner. Okay? Eighth house is the opposite of material security. So emotional security and material security are a balancing act. Okay, they're opposites of each other. And they combine to create an integrated whole of true security, internal and external security, stability, steadfastness, consistency, and reliability. The eighth house is also a dhisthana. We already talked about that with the sixth house is also a dhisthana. The eighth house is the most dhisthana of the dhisthana. And dhisthana, all you need to know for the 6th, 8th, and 12th is the difficult places or the difficult houses in the chart. This is where we learn the toughest lessons, but these lessons are the ones that stick with us because it's the hard lessons, the difficult lessons, the challenging lessons that we always remember, right? You don't remember getting, told softly not to put your hand on the stove. You remember when you put your hand on the stove and you burn it and it's painful as shit. We're going to remember that, right? Well, that's what the Dhishthanas are for. That's what the malefics or the cruel planets in our chart are for, is to give us those lessons that we will remember. It forces us to grow as spiritual beings through pain, suffering, and difficulties and challenges. And they only are perceived, I shouldn't say only, but they are usually perceived as difficulty challenges because of our consciousness, the way that we perceive reality. And so when you have more emotional security, you rely less on material security because, again, they're mirroring each other, as we said before. So the more emotionally secure you are, the less material security you need. And the more materially secure you are, the less emotional security you need, right? If you have everything you need in your external environment, materially speaking, well, then you don't really have to develop as an emotional being. But if you don't have a lot of material security, or if you go through what the 8th house represents, which is crisis, death, you experience, death around you, transformation, sudden changes, trauma, chronic pain, chronic illnesses, life-altering changes or trauma in your life, all the things the 8th house represents, well, you have to develop, it forces you to develop emotional security because the material world is unstable. There's less material security, you need more emotional security. More emotional security, you need less material security. They're just balancing each other out. Law of opposites, okay? Entanglement, if you will. So that is the 8th house. Again, it's that emotional security. And so the point of the 8th house, despite its difficulty, it is the most painful house, just like aligned with the Scorpio, which is the most painful sign because it represents our inner demons, our trauma, death, rebirth, transformation, sudden changes, crisis, chronic illnesses that we cannot get rid of. We just have to endure and face and transcend. Again, moksha, it's all about transcendence. These are another term we can use for moksha houses is transcendence. So you use the difficulties that you experience because even if you don't have planets in the 8th house, you have an 8th lord. And so wherever that goes is where you might find sudden changes, crisis, death, rebirth. The lord of the sign holding the 8th cusp or the 8th sign in your chart. So the point of those things is to develop your emotional security, to find the ability to transcend the crisis, transcend the trauma, transcend the things in your life that are holding you down, or work through them, face them to grow as a spiritual being. Now, that isn't to say that you need to feel guilty if certain crises have broken you in certain ways or if you've experienced horrendous trauma and events. This is not to say that you are emotionally insecure if you cannot handle the death of a loved one or a severe trauma that we don't have to get too deep into. You get my point? Because lots of crazy things, terrible things, horrendous things happen on this fucking planet called Earth. And so I'm not here to grandstand and say you're emotionally insecure. It's just more so understanding that certain crises in our life, the trauma we experience, the suffering, the events that we would never been able to expect, the insecurities we have about ourselves that persist no matter how much we want to change them, that there can be, if you so choose, right? You don't have to. I'm not forcing you. But if you so choose, there may be lessons that you can learn to develop your own emotional security as you acquire less and less from the external environment. Simple as that. Okay? Planets in the 8th. What does that look like? Well, these are planets that you will utilize to develop your emotional security. These are planets you will use to work through crisis or that may bring crisis into your life. These are the planets that will allow you to look inside of yourself to face your traumas, or these are planets that might hold traumas and fears and insecurities of you, depending on their significations, depending on what houses they rule, and the natural significations of that planet. Okay? Because 8th house too is also trust. It's trust in other people. It's intimacy. It's being able to fully connect with another human being. That takes emotional security, right? Does it not? To be able to trust that no matter what happens in the material world, in the external, no matter what happens with that relationship externally, I'm going to be okay. If you really boil down the 8th house to its core, its most core essence, it's regardless of what happens out there, I'm going to be okay in here. All right? And the opposite house is more so, it doesn't really matter what's going on in here. I'm going to make sure everything is going okay out here. I can always handle my responsibilities. I can always make sure that I have enough resources. I can always take care of my responsibilities and the people around me. I can make this world solid and secure for myself and the people around me. Doesn't matter how I'm feeling. So you can see the virtue in both of these houses. One is not necessarily better than the other. Obviously, if you want to transcend spiritually, well, then emotional security allows you that freedom. But sometimes it can be a lonely journey because material security, you can actually support other people. Where when you're emotionally secure, yeah, you can support others emotionally, but at the end of the day, it's about your liberation, your individual spiritual journey. And you can't do the work for somebody else. You can't guide them and help them reach enlightenment. They have to decide that. You can help, you can hold space, you can maybe give pointers, but at the end of the day, it's all of our own individual responsibilities to develop this emotional security, develop the moksha houses, the internal houses. Where the artha houses, you can get more assistance with, you can get more help with. Social houses, the kama houses, the pleasure, that always involves other people for the most part, 99% of the time. Whether you're either getting that pleasurable thing or they are the pleasurable thing that you want. So planets in the 8th house, again, are going to be related to your intimacy, related to your emotional security. And when we go around the zodiac, we always start with our idea, our inspiration at Aries. We go to the 2nd house and we start solidifying it, manifesting it, getting the resources we need to further along that journey, making it more tangible and real. Then we go to the 3rd house and we develop our skills. We're holding on to that thing that we stabilized and manifested in the 2nd. We are increasing our skills, learning about ourselves, learning about the thing that we are working with when it comes to this idea, this vision. Okay? And working with other people too, to achieve the desires and the goals short term. Then we go to the 4th house, emotional action. We start taking actions based off our emotions, seeing how this inspiration, this vision that we're following, that we started in the 1st house, this journey that we began in the 1st house, seeing how it makes us feel, seeing how the skills that we've been developing have been affecting us in the way that we perceive the world around us based off our own subjective emotional experience, 4th house. Then we go to the 5th house where we solidify our core identity based off our emotional experience and our skills and the material manifestation and our vision that we are moving towards that started in the 1st house. Then we go to the 6th house to solve any problems, fix any problems that are in the way, anything that we need to develop in ourselves to further along our journey to fulfill our dharma. Because again, we start with the dharma house here. We then solidify that dharma, that path. In the 5th, go to the 6th, we're solving any problems that are standing in the way. We start connecting intimately and closely with another person. We start interacting with other people and pursuing and taking action towards our kama, our pleasure, our desires. And then we go to the 8th house. We're at the 8th house now. And in the 8th house, you are building that ability to maneuver the crisis and the sudden changes that happen on that path as you manifest that vision, that desire, or not desire, but that vision and your dharma. Just your way, your flow, your natural state of being. What is naturally coming out of you, that self-expression, that selfness, which is the dharma house is 159. In the 8th, you are dealing with crisis. You were dealing with trauma, you were dealing with the troubles and the blocks, the emotional internal blocks that are holding you back from moving along your path, your dharmic path that is specific to you and only you. We look at the quality. What does a healthy 8th house look like? Well, I mean, you probably have a decent idea, right? It's somebody who is emotionally solid, who is able to face their inner demons, face their trauma, heal themselves by looking inside of themselves, facing their internal fears, acknowledging and releasing or transcending or dissolving all different aspects of these moksha houses, transcendence, dissolution, dissolving, or healing. Moksha houses are also about healing, dissolving, transcending trauma, the fears, the death, the rebirth, transformation, stuff, insecurities that are represented by the 8th house. The 8th house is meant to transform us into a more emotionally secure, solid person. So somebody who has a healthy 8th house is able to do that, is able to maneuver the crisis and the trauma in their life and come out stronger. A strong 8th house or good 8th lord, strong 8th lord, healthy, somebody who definitely runs by the philosophy of whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And in this case, whatever doesn't kill you or whatever dies in the external makes you emotionally more secure and stronger. Okay? Excuse me. An unhealthy 8th house is the opposite, is somebody who has difficulty facing their fears, facing trauma, dealing with crisis, going through the death and rebirth transformation. Usually crisis, these breaks will only make them weaker. Okay? And there's levels to this shit. It's not everyone's crisis, death, rebirth, transformation is the same. Some people go through stuff that almost nobody on this planet, other than maybe perhaps an enlightened being, could maneuver, could go through such loss, could see such heinous, horrendous events. So this is not to say automatically that just because you can't deal with crisis or events in your life that have occurred means that you're emotionally weak or insecure. Maybe you just went through some extra shit. But that could also be indicative of an unhealthy house, unhealthy eighth house, because that means there's just a lot of intense lessons that need to be learned. A active and even somewhat afflicted eighth house is a signification that there's a lot of hard lessons, challenges, crisis, unexpected events, and even trauma and suffering that are being experienced in this incarnation. And so it's up to you as your free will being to see how you maneuver that and see if you become emotionally stronger or it's just too much, which fair enough. Some things are just too much for one incarnation, and it might take multiple. And to evaluate the eighth house, you always want to look at the eighth house itself. Planets conjuncting the eighth house cusp, or in the eighth sign. Looking at the eighth lord, the lord of the sign that is holding the eighth cusp, or is the eighth sign in the chart. And finally, you want to look at Saturn, because Saturn is our fears, Saturn is our trauma, Saturn is that resilience, that ability to persevere. Because you need grit. You need that metal. Saturn is that metal, testing your metal, able to really withstand and even let go, surrender to the process. Because sometimes when it comes to trauma, when it comes to intense stuff, especially on this crazy planet, sometimes you have to let go. It's not something that you can hold on to. You need to just let it go. And this is Saturn. So a strong Saturn can point to somebody who can go through the death rebirth process, who can face their fears, who can really persevere past all of the hard, the most difficult, the most traumatic things that your incarnation or that person's incarnation has to offer them, because that is all what the eighth house represents. So if you have a strong eighth house, or if you have a very prominent, lots of planets there, conjunct the eighth cusp, or the eighth lord is with a bunch of planets, respect, because you've been through some shit. And it's not an easy journey, but we all have the capacity to learn incredible lessons, just like how you learn forever not to put your hand on the stove if you burn it. Better than if somebody told you gently, usually. Okay, so that was the eighth house. I would appreciate if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them down below. Or if this experience or this video resonates with you, please let me know as well. Make sure to subscribe, because in the next video, we're going to be going to the ninth house, doing the psychology of that house as well. We have the entire series. You can see all the videos up to this point, to the eighth. And then in the next, we're doing ninth. We're doing all 12 houses. So subscribe, stay on the journey, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.